In May of 1968, the USS Scorpion nuclear-powered attack submarine was conducting a last mission near the Mediterranean when she suddenly disappeared.
In May 1968, the USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered submarine, vanished without a trace in the depths of the Atlantic. 99 American sailors, lost in an instant, their fate sealed beneath the waves. The official story was one of a mechanical failure. But what if the truth was far darker? What if the Scorpion was destroyed by a secret so dangerous it had to be buried for over 50 years? In 2025, declassified files shattered the silence, revealing a truth far more chilling than anyone could have imagined.
The USS Scorpion was one of only 2 nuclear submarines ever lost by the U.S. Navy.
That's right. It sank in 1968, and the question is why?
Was it a peacetime accident? Or was it attacked?
The loss of the Scorpion was not just another tragic accident in the history of naval warfare. It became a symbol of the dark side of Cold War secrecy. The official narrative suggested that the submarine, which had completed its mission in the Mediterranean, suffered some sort of mechanical failure on its journey back to Norfolk, Virginia. However, new information, made available decades later, casts serious doubt on that explanation, raising questions about what really happened that fateful night, and why the truth remained hidden for so long.
A massive search operation was then launched, but subsequent investigations revealed a series of mishandlings from the Navy, including a potential cover-up and a rushed overhaul procedure that could have cost the lives of almost 100 sailors.
The Scorpion had left the Mediterranean, bound for Norfolk, carrying its crew of 99 men. As the submarine made its way back to port, everything appeared to be normal. There were no signs of trouble, and the crew was preparing for their return home after months at sea. The ocean was calm, and the night sky stretched endlessly above the water. There was no reason to suspect that disaster was just hours away.
5 days later, the family of the crew waits on the dock for the submarine to arrive home. It never does.
By naval protocol, submarines on patrol are required to check in regularly, sending encrypted position updates at predetermined intervals to confirm that all is well. The Scorpion was expected to send a brief signal, but that night, no message arrived. The first missed check-in did not immediately cause alarm. Communications can be delayed due to equipment malfunctions or interference from the atmosphere, and these possibilities were considered. At first, the Navy was calm, stating that there was no cause for concern and that the submarine was merely delayed. The public was reassured that the Scorpion would arrive at Norfolk on time. Families were told to expect their loved ones to return on May 27th. But behind the scenes, the situation was far from calm. Inside the Atlantic Submarine Force headquarters, and within the Pentagon's secure communications centers, senior officers were becoming increasingly concerned. As more time passed with no word from the Scorpion, the initial calm began to give way to growing anxiety. This was not a simple equipment failure. The missed check-ins, combined with the silence that stretched on for hours, indicated something far more serious. By May 23rd, the situation had escalated to a full emergency. The Navy launched a large-scale search operation, deploying surface ships, including destroyers, frigates, and rescue vessels, as well as aircraft, to scour thousands of square miles of ocean in the hopes of locating the submarine. The news coverage surrounding the search painted a picture of a heroic and determined effort to locate the missing vessel and save the crew. However, inside military circles, it was becoming increasingly clear that rescue was no longer a viable option. The Navy's secret weapon, the Sound Surveillance System SOSIS, a network of underwater microphones designed to track Soviet submarines, had already provided a grim assessment of the situation. SOSIS had recorded 2 distinct sounds on the night the Scorpion vanished. The first was a deep, thunderous noise, an acoustic signature of a submarine being crushed under the immense pressure of the deep ocean. Moments later, a second, smaller sound was recorded, confirming the catastrophe. These underwater microphones were originally placed on the ocean floor to detect and track Soviet submarines, but on that night, they picked up something far more ominous. The sound was unmistakable. It was the kind of noise only associated with the catastrophic failure of a submarine's hull, a sudden implosion that could only happen under extreme pressure. The location of the sound, captured by USS, was nearly identical to the Scorpion's last known position. To the trained ears of naval acoustic analysts, there was no doubt the Scorpion had been lost, and it had not been due to a mechanical failure. Yet, despite this, the Navy kept its findings secret, continuing to issue reassuring statements to the public. They insisted that the search was ongoing, and that they still hoped to locate survivors. But the families of the sailors aboard the Scorpion, anxiously awaiting their loved ones' return in Norfolk, had no idea what was truly happening. By 3 p.m. on May 27th, the Navy made the official declaration that the Scorpion was missing in action. The code phrase used was Event Su Bimis, a chilling admission that a U.S. submarine had vanished from the face of the Earth without a trace. The Navy, despite knowing what had truly happened, chose not to reveal the full extent of the disaster to the public. The sounds recorded by USS were damning, suggesting an attack, but the Navy opted to keep the truth under wraps. This decision was influenced by the intense political and diplomatic climate of the Cold War, where any admission of vulnerability could lead to catastrophic consequences. Acknowledging that the Scorpion had been attacked, especially by a foreign submarine, would have triggered a crisis and possibly led to open conflict. So, the Navy buried the truth. In the days and weeks following the disappearance, the families of the missing sailors were left in a state of uncertainty and mourning. They were told that the search would continue, and that their loved ones would be found, but the reality was far darker. The official story, carefully crafted by the Navy, was one of mechanical failure and accident. But for those who had access to the classified records, the truth was much more complicated. The SOSIS recordings, though classified at the highest levels, painted a much grimmer picture than anyone had been willing to admit. What had really happened beneath the waves on that quiet night in May? The families of the 99 sailors who vanished were left with more questions than answers, and for decades, the mystery of the USS Scorpion remained unsolved. What seemed like a routine disappearance had far more sinister undertones, buried under layers of secrecy. It was a secret that the US government chose to keep hidden, a secret that would remain buried for over 50 years. In 2025, the silence was finally shattered. Newly declassified files revealed a startling and terrifying truth about the fate of the Scorpion. But what had been hidden for so long? What really happened beneath the waves? The answer, it seems, was far more complex and disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. The mystery of the USS Scorpion had remained just that for decades, until now. What was the truth, and why had it been kept from the public for so long? The files released in 2025 not only confirmed what many had long suspected, but they also revealed even darker truths. The mystery of the USS Scorpion was not just one of mechanical failure, but of political expedience, Cold War secrecy, and the lives of the brave sailors who paid the ultimate price for a war that was fought in silence beneath the waves. As new information comes to light, the full story of what really happened to the Scorpion and its crew will finally be known. On May 22, 1968, the USS Scorpion, a skipjack-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, embarked on what should have been a routine journey back to Norfolk, Virginia, after completing its mission in the Mediterranean. The submarine, which had been at sea for several months, was now heading home, carrying 99 crew members, who were eager to reunite with their families. The mood aboard the vessel was typical for a returning deployment, focused yet relaxed. There was no reason to believe that this journey would end in tragedy. However, by the end of that night, the fate of the Scorpion and its crew would be sealed, and the ocean would claim them all. The ocean surrounding the Scorpion was calm, and the night sky stretched endlessly above them. The submarine, as it cruised through the Atlantic, encountered no obvious signs of trouble. On board, the crew went about their duties, perhaps with the distant thought of returning home after months of service. For them, the day seemed like any other. Yet beneath the surface of the calm water, disaster was already unfolding. Naval protocol required submarines to maintain regular check-ins while on patrol, sending encrypted position updates to confirm their status. The Scorpion was expected to send a brief signal to confirm that everything was well and that there were no problems. These regular updates were standard procedure, a routine part of the operation that had been followed many times before. However, on the evening of May 22nd, no such signal came. At first, this went unnoticed, as communications can sometimes be delayed due to minor equipment failures or interference from the atmosphere. Delays were not unusual, and so the absence of the expected signal did not immediately raise any alarms. The first missed check-in did not trigger panic. The Navy was used to such delays, and the initial assumption was that there had been a technical glitch, or perhaps atmospheric interference that had disrupted the signal. The public was reassured that there was no cause for alarm. The Navy insisted that the Scorpion was simply delayed, and that it would arrive in Norfolk on time, as scheduled, on May 27th. Families of the crew members were told to expect their loved ones' return, and were encouraged to remain calm. There was no indication that anything was amiss, and the Navy continued to assure the public that the situation was not unusual. Behind the scenes, however, the mood was far from calm. As the hours passed without any communication from the Scorpion, concerns began to grow within the Navy. By May 23rd, senior officers at the Atlantic Submarine Force Headquarters and the Pentagon's Secure Communications Centers were becoming deeply alarmed. This was not a minor delay. The absence of communication was a break with established protocol. A submarine simply did not disappear without any explanation, especially one as advanced as the Scorpion. The absence of updates raised troubling questions, and it quickly became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Inside the Navy, the situation was being treated as a serious emergency, but this was not immediately made public. The Navy initiated a large-scale search operation, deploying surface ships, including destroyers, frigates, and rescue vessels, to scour the waters of the Atlantic. Aircraft were also dispatched to join the search, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. The public was told that this was a rescue operation, and that the search was ongoing, with the hope that the submarine would be found, and the crew would be brought home safely. The media painted the search effort as a heroic operation, an all-out attempt to locate the missing vessel. However, within military circles, the tone was far more grim. The idea of rescue was rapidly fading, and it became clear that the Scorpion was lost. By this point, a powerful secret tool of the Navy had already confirmed the worst possible scenario. The Sound Surveillance System, or SUSIS, was a network of underwater microphones strategically placed on the ocean floor to monitor and track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. This highly classified system, which was not even known to the public at the time, had been monitoring the Atlantic for any signs of Soviet activity. On the night the Scorpion vanished, SUSIS had picked up two distinct sounds that were unlike anything the system had recorded before. The first was a low, thunderous sound, an underwater shockwave that reverberated through the seafloor. It was the unmistakable acoustic signature of a submarine being crushed under the immense pressure of the deep ocean. Moments later, a second, smaller sound was recorded. It was the unmistakable sound of a submarine hull imploding, catastrophic failure. This discovery, which occurred behind the scenes, confirmed that the Scorpion had been lost, and its destruction had been sudden and violent. The location of the sounds, triangulated by SUSIS, placed them approximately 400 miles southwest of the Azores, right where the Scorpion had been expected to be. To those in the Navy who had access to this classified data, there was no question about what had happened. The Scorpion had been destroyed, but the Navy kept this information from the public. Instead, they continued to issue official statements, hoping to maintain an air of optimism, and suggesting that the situation was still a search and rescue operation. The families of the missing crew members, waiting at the docks of Norfolk on May 27th, were told to expect their loved ones' return. They had no idea that the Scorpion would never come home. The Navy continued to reassure the public, treating the situation as one where rescue was still possible. But by 3 p.m. on May 27th, the Navy was forced to admit the truth. The Scorpion was officially declared missing in action. The code phrase "Event Submarine" was used, an acknowledgement that a U.S. submarine had disappeared without a trace. The silence of the Scorpion had revealed a terrifying truth, one that would not be made public for decades. The Navy's USS system had recorded the final moments of the submarine, but those records would remain classified for many years. While the families mourned, thinking their loved ones might still be alive, the Navy was already fully aware of the Scorpion's fate. The official story remained one of mechanical failure, a tragic accident at sea. But those who had access to the classified information knew better. They knew the submarine had been destroyed, and they knew how. Yet, to protect national security, and to avoid escalating tensions in the Cold War, the truth was kept hidden. The tragedy of the Scorpion was not just a matter of lost lives. It was a story of secrecy, deception, and political calculation. The families of the 99 sailors who perished had no way of knowing what had truly happened to their loved ones. For decades, they would be left with no answers, forced to accept an incomplete story. The official narrative, the story of a mechanical failure, was one that served the interests of the government, but it did not tell the real story. That story would remain buried for over 50 years. As the years went by, the mystery of the USS Scorpion became one of the most enduring naval tragedies of the Cold War. The official account remained unchanged, and the families continued to seek answers. It wasn't until 2025, when newly declassified documents began to surface, that the truth about the Scorpion's fate finally started to emerge. The mystery, which had been kept hidden for so long, would finally be unraveled, but for many it was too late. The families who had waited for decades to learn the truth would finally know what happened to their loved ones. But the revelations came with a heavy price. The truth was far darker and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. In June 1960, just weeks after the USS Scorpion had vanished beneath the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy convened a formal court of inquiry. To the outside world, this appeared to be a thorough investigation into the disappearance, a solemn attempt to bring closure to the families of the 99 crew members, and to the nation. The inquiry was expected to shed light on what had happened, and provide answers about how such a tragic event could have occurred. The families, the media, and the military personnel all watched and waited, hoping for clarity and truth. However, what unfolded behind closed doors was far from the comprehensive and transparent investigation that the public had expected. From the outset, the court of inquiry seemed more like a performance than a genuine search for the truth. The official purpose of the inquiry was to determine the cause of the Scorpion's disappearance, and to ensure that no one was at fault. However, as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that this was not a genuine effort to uncover the facts, but rather a carefully orchestrated attempt to avoid revealing the full truth. The inquiry was designed to ask all the wrong questions, while deliberately avoiding the ones that really mattered. The inquiry brought together a panel of experts in submarine engineering, naval operations, and acoustic analysis. These experts were expected to help uncover what had caused the loss of the Scorpion, and to provide insight into the technical and operational aspects of the submarine's mission. More than 70 witnesses testified, ranging from officers aboard nearby ships to sonar technicians and naval engineers. Hundreds of pages of evidence were submitted, including technical reports, sonar logs, and maintenance records. The Navy hoped that this would demonstrate their commitment to transparency and accountability. At the heart of the inquiry were the SOS recordings, the acoustic data that had been captured by the Navy's sound surveillance system. These recordings, which were taken at the time of the Scorpion's final moments, were crucial pieces of evidence. They clearly indicated that the submarine had been destroyed by an external force, not a mechanical failure or an internal accident, as was being claimed by the Navy. The SOS data showed two distinct acoustic events. First, a sharp explosive shockwave, followed by a second, deeper sound. the unmistakable implosion of the submarine's hull under the crushing pressure of the ocean. This was the first conclusive evidence that the Scorpion had been lost due to an external force, not an internal malfunction. However, despite the significance of this evidence, the SOS recordings were barely mentioned in the inquiry. When they were acknowledged, they were presented in vague and technical terms that obscured the true meaning of the data. The inquiry's official reports did little to shed light on what the SOS recordings really indicated. The crucial fact that the Scorpion had likely been attacked was never openly discussed, and the evidence that pointed to this conclusion was buried under layers of ambiguity. This omission of critical evidence was not accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to suppress the truth, a decision that was made at the highest levels of the Navy. Those involved in the inquiry, including senior officers and analysts, were well aware of the implications of the SOS recordings. They knew that the Scorpion had been destroyed by an external force, likely the result of a Soviet attack, but admitting this would have been politically and diplomatically disastrous. At the height of the Cold War, admitting that one of America's most advanced nuclear submarines had been sunk by the Soviet Union would have risked igniting a global conflict. Instead of confronting this reality, the Navy chose to keep the findings of the SOS data a secret. They opted to focus on alternative explanations that would not jeopardize the fragile peace between the US and the Soviet Union. The official line from the Navy remained that the Scorpion's disappearance could not be conclusively explained, but it was likely the result of a mechanical failure or an internal accident. This narrative, which was echoed in the inquiry's findings, was one of uncertainty and avoidance, designed to placate the public and avoid escalating tensions during a particularly dangerous time in world history. For the families of the missing sailors, the Court of Inquiry provided no answers. They had hoped for closure, for a clear explanation of what had happened to their loved ones. Instead, they were left with more questions and a sense of profound dissatisfaction. The inquiry's official report was bland and inconclusive, offering only speculation and uncertainty. The families were told that the Scorpion's disappearance was likely due to a mechanical failure, but there was no clear explanation of how or why this could have happened. The findings offered no definitive answers and no sense of closure for those who had lost everything. Behind the scenes, however, there was growing dissatisfaction among some of the Navy's officers and analysts. They were frustrated by the inquiry's failure to address the most pressing questions, and by the deliberate suppression of crucial evidence. Many of them knew that the official story was not true, but they were powerless to change the narrative. The political stakes of the Cold War were simply too high. Admitting that the Scorpion had been attacked by the Soviets could have set off a chain of events that would have escalated tensions to a breaking point. The Cold War was a delicate and dangerous game, and in this case, the truth was deemed too perilous to reveal. The inquiry's findings were sealed and kept classified for decades, and the families of the lost sailors were left in the dark. They had no idea that the truth had been suppressed, that the Navy had already known the real cause of the Scorpion's destruction. Instead, they were forced to live with the official story, one that offered no closure or comfort. The families continued to grieve without ever knowing the full truth about what had happened to their loved ones. The Court of Inquiry, which was meant to bring accountability and transparency, had instead become a tool for maintaining secrecy. The Navy's decision to withhold critical information from the public and to suppress the truth was a reflection of the broader political climate of the time. The Cold War was a time of intense geopolitical rivalry, and the stakes were high. In such a climate, the truth was often sacrificed in favor of maintaining national security and avoiding conflict. The inquiry's failure to ask the right questions and its deliberate avoidance of the truth were symptomatic of the lengths to which the US government was willing to go to protect its interests during the Cold War. For years, the mystery of the US Scorpion remained unresolved. The inquiry had failed to provide answers, and the families were left with nothing but speculation and uncertainty. It wasn't until decades later that the truth began to emerge. As Cold War-era documents were declassified and new information came to light, the full story of what happened to the Scorpion started to be revealed. The inquiry, which had been designed to contain the truth, had instead become a symbol of the lengths to which the US government had gone to protect its secrets. In the end, the inquiry did little to uncover the truth. The families of the lost sailors were left without the answers they had been seeking, and the Navy's official story remained unchallenged for many. The inquiry had been an exercise in investigation, but it was not a genuine effort to bring out the truth. Instead, it was a performance designed to maintain the narrative that the Cold War powers were determined to protect at all costs. It was a mystery that would remain hidden for decades, leaving the families and the public to wonder about the events that had led to the tragic loss of the US Scorpion. In October 1968, 5 months after the disappearance of the US Scorpion, the U.S. Navy made a somber announcement that the wreckage had been located. The submarine was found nearly 3,000 meters beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, resting silently on the ocean floor. To the public, this discovery seemed to mark the end of the Scorpion's tragic story, and the official explanation for its destruction was that it had been caused by some kind of mechanical failure or accident. The photographs of the wreckage released by the Navy showed a broken hull, torn and twisted by the crushing pressure of the deep, which seemed to corroborate the official narrative of an implosion due to the extreme depths. However, behind the scenes, what the Navy discovered beneath those waves was far more disturbing than the public was ever led to believe. The condition of the wreckage didn't match the story that the Navy had presented. While it was true that the hull had been severely damaged, it wasn't uniformly crushed, as would be expected from a submarine that had suffered a catastrophic implosion at depth. Certain sections of the Scorpion's outer structure showed evidence of an external force. The damage appeared to have come from the outside, not from the crushing pressure of the ocean depths. These signs of external trauma, such as parts of the submarine's outer structure being blasted outward rather than inward, raised serious questions about the Navy's official explanation. The more closely the wreckage was examined, the more troubling the details became. There were clear indications that the Scorpion had suffered a violent impact, likely from an explosion or a torpedo strike. The damage to the hull didn't line up with the theory of a mechanical failure or an internal malfunction. If the submarine had been crushed by the pressure of the deep ocean, the damage would have been more uniform, with no obvious signs of an external blast. This discovery suggested that something much more sinister had occurred. The Scorpion might not have been destroyed by an accident or mechanical failure at all. It could have been the victim of a hostile attack. Even more puzzling was the timeline of the discovery. While the Navy announced in October that the wreckage had been located, internal records and ship logs suggested that the Scorpion's resting place had been found much earlier, perhaps as soon as June 1968, just weeks after the submarine's disappearance. The Navy had already conducted covert operations in the area, gathering sonar data and visual confirmation of the wreck. Yet, despite this, the Navy waited several months before publicly revealing the discovery. Why the delay? Why had the Navy kept the location of the wreck a secret for so long, especially when they had already confirmed the submarine's fate? The answer lay in the geopolitical realities of the Cold War. The discovery of the Scorpion's wreckage, coupled with the evidence of external damage, raised uncomfortable questions. The damage to the submarine's hull seemed to point to an attack, possibly by a foreign power, and the most likely culprit was the Soviet Union. At the time, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were at their height, and the Cold War was a volatile and dangerous period in global history. Any admission that the Scorpion had been attacked by a Soviet submarine would have had catastrophic consequences. Such an admission would have been seen as a provocative act, potentially triggering a full-scale war between the two superpowers. The Navy's decision to keep the discovery of the wreckage a secret, and to downplay the significance of the external damage, was made with this in mind. The official story needed to be one of an accident or mechanical failure, something that could be easily explained away without provoking international tensions. If the Scorpion had been attacked by a Soviet submarine, it could have led to a dangerous escalation, perhaps even to nuclear war. In such a charged political climate, The Navy chose to protect national security and avoid the risk of sparking a conflict. This meant that the truth about what had really happened to the Scorpion remained hidden, buried under layers of secrecy. For the families of the 99 sailors who perished aboard the submarine, this was another blow. They had already endured the pain of losing their loved ones, and now they were being denied the full truth about what had happened. Instead of the closure they had hoped for, they were left with more unanswered questions. They had been told that the Scorpion had been lost to a mechanical failure, and now they learned that the Navy had known far more than they had let on. The families were left to wonder why the truth had been hidden from them for so long, and what the Navy had been trying to protect by keeping this information secret. The deception continued for decades. In the years following the discovery of the wreckage, the Navy maintained its official story, sticking to the narrative of a mechanical failure. The idea that the Scorpion had been destroyed by a torpedo or some other form of external attack was never acknowledged, and the families were left with no clear explanation of how or why their loved ones had died. The Navy had the information, but it chose to withhold it, prioritizing political considerations over transparency and accountability. In the years that followed, the mystery of the Scorpion continued to linger. Historians, journalists, and Cold War scholars all tried to piece together the fragments of the story, but the full truth remained elusive. As the decades passed, more and more pieces of the puzzle began to surface, but they were often incomplete, redacted, or fragmentary. The declassification of documents was a slow process, and many of the most sensitive files remained sealed for years. It wasn't until 2025, nearly 6 decades after the Scorpion's disappearance, that the full story began to emerge. The declassification of Cold War naval archives in 2025 provided a flood of new information, including detailed navigation logs, intercepted communications, and acoustic data from the once secret SOS surveillance system. These documents confirmed what many had suspected, that the Scorpion had been the victim of a hostile attack. The acoustic recordings from USS showed evidence of an external explosion, followed by the implosion of the submarine's hull. This evidence matched the timeline of the Scorpion's disappearance, and left no room for doubt. The submarine had been destroyed by an external force, likely a Soviet torpedo. In addition to the USS data, newly declassified memos and reports revealed that, as early as May 24, 1968, the Navy had detected an unidentified submerged contact near the Scorpion's last known position. The memo, addressed to the commander of Submarine Force Atlantic, described this contact as being consistent with a hostile foreign submarine, almost certainly Soviet. This was the smoking gun that confirmed the Scorpion's destruction had not been an accident. It had been attacked, but the Navy had chosen not to reveal this fact to the public. For the families of the lost sailors, this revelation was both a bittersweet vindication and a painful reminder of the decades of lies they had endured. After 50 years of waiting for answers, they finally knew the truth about how and why their loved ones had died. But the truth came with a heavy cost. It was too late for the families to confront those responsible, or to seek justice for the cover-up. The damage had been done, and the secrecy had taken its toll. The truth about the Scorpion's fate was buried for decades, and the decision to keep it hidden for so long remains one of the darkest chapters of Cold War history. The Navy's decision to prioritize political considerations over transparency and accountability left a legacy of mistrust and unanswered questions. For the families of the 99 sailors, the revelation of the truth was a painful reminder of how easily the lives of ordinary people could be sacrificed in the name of national security. The Scorpion story is not just a tale of military tragedy. It is a reminder of the high cost of secrecy and the dangers of protecting a nation's interests at the expense of its people. The legacy of the USS Scorpion lives on as a symbol of the Cold War's hidden dangers, the secrets that were kept buried beneath the surface, and the lives that were lost in the pursuit of global power. The truth, once hidden for so long, finally emerged, but it came too late for those who needed it most. The families of the lost sailors were left to carry the weight of a secret that had been kept from them for more than 50 years, and the world was left to reckon with the consequences of a decision made in the darkest days of the Cold War.